So one of the things I wanted to talk about was the whole idea. It's not even an idea, just the existence of emotionally vulnerable relationships, right? Because so many times when we start relationships, we say, "Oh, we want our partner, we want our spouse, we want the person that we're going to end up with being emotionally vulnerable." And I always want to ask, like, do you really know what that means, right? Because you ask people what emotionally vulnerable looks like, sometimes what you might hear is, "Oh, I want that person to really be present for me when things happen. I want them to understand my emotions. I want them and not fully understand, but get an understanding of me emotionally, can respect how they are, can feel safe. You can feel safe in being in front of that person." And when I say being in front of that person, I mean in the aspect of not having that emotional mask on, right? Where you can truly be yourself and not feel that it's going to backfire against you. You feel protected, you feel nurtured in that space. And, I hear that, and usually, well, not all the time, but sometimes that's all that I hear, right? And I'm like, do you not understand? Do we not understand that there is another aspect of having a vulnerable, emotionally vulnerable relationship and a safe space within that relationship? And that is allowing space for the other person to be emotionally vulnerable. And that's the part that can sometimes trip people up. Or I don't even say trip, that sometimes people don't fully take in, because in almost a selfish way, sometimes we want our partners to be emotionally vulnerable with us in the way that we want them to be emotionally vulnerable with us. We want them to, in the midst of a deep conversation, we want them to tell us how they feel, right? We're saying that is how we want to experience emotional vulnerability with that person. We want them to open up to us about certain things that sometimes we bring up the conversation. I was like, "Well, why won't you share XYZ?" And I'm like, for us to really understand is that for a healthy, emotionally vulnerable environment to exist, both parties have to be safe to be vulnerable within their own context, right? Which means we can't define how that person is going to be vulnerable or chooses to be vulnerable with us. We can't we have to release this notion that their vulnerability has to be talking about certain things, because their vulnerability may not be talking about the relationship on a super deep level. And when I say deep level, I mean as a mirror of how you express things, right? Because that person's love language may be different, and we have to think about that. And so the way that they are vulnerable, it it may be different from you if, one, you haven't experienced someone who is being emotionally vulnerable with you and they're leading how they're being emotionally vulnerable with you, and two, if we have this preconceived notion of how a person should be vulnerable with us, right? Y'all know I'm a retired therapist, and so when I sit back and think. I used to think, oh yeah, someone will tell me, if this is happening in their lives and this is happening in their lives, and that's not the case. That's me pushing my ideas and expectation on how I want them to express their emotional vulnerability to me, without asking them how they want to express it, and most definitely not putting them in a position. And so, a part of this shift in thought, right, to where a person can feel safe is that number one, we can't have expectations of how a person should be vulnerable with us. That's for them to define, and is based upon like their being comfortable with you, and also it's based upon, go in there with your dad. It's also being based upon, hold on, y'all know I don't. No, go in there with your father. Go to Pop Pop. Or go to bed. Those are your options. But go to Pop Pop or go to bed. And so, the furry child is being needy this morning. And so one and so the thing that we have to so you have to get past that expectation, right, of what you think that vulnerability is going to look like. Another thing is you actually have to be prepared for how that person is going to present it. And that is very, very key here, right? Because we're generally have not, for those of us who are older, have had to learn how to integrate being emotionally vulnerable personally, but also having to learn how to accept that emotional vulnerability for someone else. For instance, can you accept that your partner may be attempting to manage depression or anxiety and cannot interact with you the way that you desire them to be? That sometimes that space and being vulnerable is telling you that right now they can't necessarily be around you in the way that you need them to be. They may not be up to going out, or they may need to go to the gym and detox themselves, or maybe they're not interested in solving things the way that you would solve them, right? And so, like, do you hold space for that person without it damaging, and this is the key part, without it damaging how you view them? In a world of toxic masculinity, in those spaces, someone may view someone as soft or a simp, or for how they tend to express themselves. And there's these surface level expressions, right? There's these surface level expressions that's happening, but then at the same time there's some really, really deeper levels, and you have to ask yourself, can you be the supporter in that? Because we know how to receive their support when we're having bad days, when we're emotionally off. But can you be the supporter of that? Can you be the person that takes that person out to dinner? Can you be the person that maybe, how y'all are divided in chores around the household, or the things that you do for each other, that you can take over things so that person can rest and catch their breath? Can you be okay with them stepping out to go to do certain things without you, and spending time with their friends? Like, can you accept how they deal with their emotionally vulnerability, and not just how they deal with their emotional vulnerability, but how they manage it, the things around it. Because if they're emotionally vulnerable and telling you that they're dealing with something like depression, for instance, it may not be, you may not be the source. You may not be that key factor that helps them get to that next level, whether they do therapy, they take medication, they go to the gym, whatever it is, spend more time with their friends, whatever it is. Are you okay with not being that center person, especially when you're going through something that your partner may be your center person, like maybe your anchor? But are you okay if you're not their anchor? Because again, how they define and express and go through those emotionally vulnerable moments are going to be different from person to person. It may be different from yours. And so are you okay with how someone's expresses their emotional vulnerability without taking it personal? And that's a very key factor. Do we take these things personal? And do we know how to say, hey, I don't want to talk right now? Or acknowledge that your partner does not want to talk to you tonight and they need to de-escalate, have moments with themselves. I always integrate myself, and my partner and I, we go through this a lot, where we just have to tell each other we need space. When we first did this, it was somewhat personal. Like, why don't you want to talk to me? Why don't you want to be around me? But it's not that. It's genuinely that person taking a space from everything. And maybe they can't be that emotional anchor for you in that moment, and it's that space. As I was saying, when we take our emotional space, I know that my partner is unable to be my anchor in that moment. And so I have to be my own anchor, or I have to reach out to my other anchors, having that space beyond the person that you're in a relationship, friendship, social supports. That's why it's so important not to make the person that you're with your entire world. But can you be okay if they need to have a separation so that they can balance themselves? All of that is a part of creating an environment of emotional vulnerability. Because once the emotional vulnerability is displayed, there has to be a safe space that it can be navigated in. And so, in that, working through those issues or managing those issues or experiencing those feelings can be safely managed through in a safe space. And like, can you provide that for someone? Like, can you provide what you desire to have for someone else? Because there are people who can go through certain things and things roll off their backs, and there's certain people who cannot. And so when we ask ourselves, or we tell ourselves, oh, we want our partner to be emotionally vulnerable, are we just saying that for ourselves? Or do we want them to be emotionally vulnerable for my benefit? Or are we trying to ensure that it also includes the benefit of our partner, right? That I will be able to hold space for them. Now, let me tell you, if you feel like that you can't do that, this isn't a beat you up or, oh, shame on you. It's important to know if you can hold that space for someone, if you have the capacity to ever be able to hold that space for someone, because that is a key for you to know that maybe this person might not be your person. You don't have to demean someone who isn't your person or is not a good fit. It just may not be, and that is fine. However, we have to be mindful and ask those questions in the beginning of meeting someone. What does emotional vulnerability look like for you? And do you feel like you've been in spaces where you could be emotionally vulnerable? Those are key things to ask, and fair things to ask, because if you have an expectation of receiving that, then the person that you're with may have the same expectation expectation that they may want to receive that from you. So, just some things to consider. As you know, the household is waking up. I will chat with y'all later. Bye.